Our first speaker this morning, unfortunately, is ill and cannot attend, so Scott Rushe from Seedway will not be here, and we're lucky enough to have Greg Roth from Penn State University is going to give Scott's talk.
I'm going to call on some of my friends at the front table here to be my seed industry supporters if I run into any trouble, but Scott is under the weather a little bit. He's been a big supporter, as Seedway has, and a number of our seed industry professionals at making cover crops happen. So I'm going to try to give his presentation that he pulled together to talk about some of the issues he's seeing. I think they're pretty consistent with what the rest of you have seen. And see if I can get things moving here. I guess Scott's reporting he's seen a lot of growth in cover crops in their company, and I know they've responded with new introductions. He's saying they've seen 60% growth in acres from 2009 to 2015. By my driving around the countryside in Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland, I would say that's probably true. And he's seeing that he's reporting seed sales have increased by 90% in that same period of time. And he's saying that interest in cover cropping has spread from Midwestern states to the Northeast. I would have actually thought it would be the other way around. Maybe that's a typo. But so I actually give a lot of our farmers credit in the region for being leaders in innovation. I think you guys would probably agree on that one. And some of our Midwestern counterparts have been having some interesting conversation with some of our folks. And he's making a note that the market has declined on sowing monocultures, and there's greater interest for some of the reasons our speakers yesterday talked about, I think, on mixtures. But some of the monocultures that we see most being marketed are things like the forage radish, the cereal rye, annual ryegrass, and crimson clover. And it kind of is interesting. Several of those haven't in the past. They didn't have that big of a role in agriculture. They're kind of newcomers to the seed scene, I would say, in the last decade or so. And the mixtures of those, as our speakers yesterday talked about, it can provide multiple benefits. Things like erosion control, scavenging nutrients, emergency forage, and then increased biomass production. And I think we'd all agree with that. And here's a couple examples of some of the Seedway mixes they're working with. Austrian winter pea and daikon radish, and that's providing nitrogen fixation, nutrient scavenging, and aerification. Triticale annual ryegrass, that's erosion control, emergency forage, and biomass. Annual ryegrass and crimson clover, erosion control, nitrogen fixation, and biomass. Triticale, crimson clover, and daikon radish, erosion control, nitrogen fixation, aerification, nutrient scavenging, and biomass. So in addition to the mixtures, as you've talked about, Steve, so many times, helping the plants helping each other out, if I gathered that right from your presentations, then they also can adapt to different situations and provide multiple benefits. And so I think this is a concept most of you have understand. I guess Scott's wanted to impress on us that knowing what's in a bag of seed is critical, and taking a look at the seed tag and I guess the germination and the purity of the seed. I know Scott's real frustrated with the widespread use of bin run seed, and he's a believer that cover crop seed should come from reputable seed sources. So as most of you know, there's a lot of bin run cover crop seed used, and that presents a problem for I think everybody in the seed industry in multiple ways. He's saying that bin run seed is seed that's harvested on the farm and used to reseed on the farm and or sold to neighboring farms for less cost than certified seed. I think it's often can be heavily discounted, right? And then he's seeing the potential issues are poor germination, spread of noxious weeds like Palmer amaranth, and then the genetics can get mixed up. And I might add one from my perspective that I've run into is it really detracts from the development of new materials for us to use. In the small grains, for example, like rye, there's like no motivation for anybody to develop rye varieties when everybody replants the seed. And Seedway introduced a hybrid rye from Europe, and if you look back at the Europeans, for some reasons they're investing heavily in rye breeding. So now we're dependent on the Europeans for rye seed because nobody's invested in rye breeding, here in the States. So that's part of the consequence of the bin run seed, that issue that Scott's trying to put out. And he's pointing out that farmers are getting support from the government to do cover crops, and that's great. But what he's running into is that sometimes there's requirements that the seed is certified, and then farmers will only purchase maybe a small amount of certified seed, use that as their, have you ever seen this? And then most of the seed they're using has been run. So they're getting around the system, and the quality is compromised, and Scott's a believer that that should be enforced a little tighter, and that growers should adhere to using certified seed. You can see both sides of the argument a little bit, but Scott's adamant about trying to stick with the way the laws were written. Another issue he's been talking about has been innovations in how we get more cover crops in the ground. And we talked about this yesterday also, and some of the innovations that have occurred over the last few years in cover crop equipment. Of course, one is the interseeder we talked about yesterday. Another thing that Steve and Dave and Scott have all been involved in is development of adapting products to the new technique of interseeding. So in this case, Scott's talking about this Freya annual ryegrass, which is a new superior, cold hardy, high yielding variety they're marketing. So that's one role the seed industry has had to do, and from my perspective has been good at trying to keep up with innovations farmers have come up with in equipment to facilitate interseeding. Another shot of our interseeder. Another one has been the use of the turbo tills in air delivery systems to facilitate rapid large acreage cover crop sowing in some areas. I believe this might be on the eastern shore, and that's probably been a great market for large-scale cover crop seeding in some areas, and doing it in a rapid fashion to cover a lot of acres. And this also is something I haven't seen a lot of in our area in the last 10 years, but seems to be one of those things that's growing. And then another one we've heard about is planting into the green planting that Sword talked about yesterday, and using heavy small grain crops for residues, and how this is picking up and being innovative. I guess in our area, I've noticed growers cut back on the rye seeding rate so you don't quite get overwhelming rye biomass to work with. So that's another innovation that Scott's been seeing. And I believe we'll hear more about the rolling technology that we've been discussing as part of the management of these heavy rye crops later today. and here's an example of a farmer up in Clinton County that Scott's worked with a lot, who has this is in central Pennsylvania, not on the eastern shore, but he has the same kind of system in wheat. And actually, I got to visit Scott this fall, and he said he's been turned on by it because he's seeing a 20 bushel yield bump for having a good cover crop after wheat compared to just planting in the stubble. So he's become a believer in soil improvement due to cover cropping. And he's doing sort of for commercial purposes, seeing the benefits. And fortunately, he has wheat in his rotation. And then also we have a number of folks using aerial applications to facilitate cover cropping throughout the Northeast, and that's been another market for the seed industry to tap into. And that, I believe, has been growing over the last decade as well. And so this is Scott, and I think our other friends in the industry have been continuing to look outside the box to provide us with newer and sexier seed solutions. And I think a number of you have played with this. I've only planted sun hemp once, but sun hemp is his example here of something that showed up on the scene in the last few years as a multi-purpose tropical legume planted in wheat stubble, which has super high nitrogen fixation potential, produces a lot of biomass, suppresses nematodes, and then I believe another aspect of utilization of sun hemp has been as a forage crop. I think initially folks seem to be cautious about using sun hemp for a forage. Is that correct, Dave? But now I'm seeing that there is some forage utilization.
Some varieties, tropic sun doesn't have the plant output.
Okay, so going even further, there's certain varieties that have less alkaloids. I guess as I was preparing for this with my smartphone at breakfast, I saw that somebody in Western Maryland had done a goat grazing trial and had good success with sun hemp in the summer. So it's an interesting how so many of these things can come on the scene, and we find an adaptation in our cropping systems. And if those of you that have grown sun hemp, it can get quite tall, be a good producer, and often there's some mixtures that I see the industry has developed to complement sun hemp that might leave something in the over winter, because it's an annual that gets killed by frost. So apparently Scott and Seedway have had some good experiences as others in sowing sun hemp in June here and ending up with a lot of biomass in the fall in a wheat field. I guess that's what Scott wanted to share. They've, like other partners in the seed industry, I think they've expanded their offerings. They're focusing on mixtures. They're adapting to new application techniques, and they're a little bit concerned about the use of bin-run seed to reduce their marketplace. So, any comments from Steve or Dave to follow up that you'd like to make on what the seed industry is doing to support cover cropping?
What we're seeing with a lot of the varieties are forage varieties that are readapted for cover crops. So our selection process is actually coming from a lot of the forage varieties that are available. And we look at something like crimson clover that we market. The variety name is Dixie. So where does that come from? That's below the Mason-Dixon line. We're trying to plant that in New York, and we're getting over winter hardiness selectively in different areas depending on snow cover and whatnot. But that's part of the challenge of adapting these. So in looking at the further development of different varieties and selection, we need to expand that process, And from the forage point of view, the mixes that we put together that do make good forage mixtures also oftentimes make good cover crop mixtures. That, we're looking at a carbon to nitrogen ratio as a cover crop mixture, or we're looking at a protein and energy ratio as a forage.
Well, first of all, it's mentioned that about me being part of the seed industry, and that certainly has been the case the last 5 years. And some of you may know I'm transitioning out of that to be more of a cover crop consultant. So I'll just say that to cover that. But I would like to talk a little bit about the bin run seed issue, because if you're farmers here, you're like, who cares about those seed companies? They're just trying to sell their own product. And to a point, yeah, that is correct. So, but I will, and again, I can say both sides of the issue there. There is concern with resistant weeds and so forth. I mean, it is legal to use seed and use it for your own self. If you start selling it, then you are in violation of seed laws. And believe me, there will be, that is being thoroughly discussed with the industry. There will be some people who will find out that it wasn't worth it to at least sell seed to their neighbor. Okay, so I can also tell you that there is thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars spent in bringing some of this seed to the market. And so you do have to respect seed companies for doing that. As was mentioned, if you want better varieties in the future, that money got to come from somewhere. So there's kind of it's a fine line, if you will. So you're allowed to grow your own seed, but then the other thing about buying seed from a neighbor, what weeds may you be getting in that? You may be getting some things that you don't want. And believe me, there's a lot goes on in the seed industry to hide things like that. And I got to tell you here, even among seed companies, there's very shady things go on. I know a little too much about that. Deal with people that have a good reputation. And if you really want to check sometime, do your own test on some seeds and see what shows up. I have been a part of hundreds of seed tests. It's amazing the surprises that you see sometimes. So I just put that out as a word of caution as well. Deal with reputable seed companies. And I think, at the end that will, best pay and so forth. So a little bit of my perspective in that.
Good.
Maybe trying to walk both sides of it, but for whatever it's worth.
Thanks a lot, Greg. It was good for filling in there. I appreciate it. And thanks, Steve, for those comments on the bin run seed. That was good information for those people who buy seed and sell seed.